So today we're going to be talking about Sacajawea, and Sacajawea was actually a very interesting woman. So she was born to the Shoshone tribe, which was located near Salmon, Idaho, over the border. But when she was 11 years old, she was actually captured by a rival tribe called the Hidatsa, and was actually taken into what is now present-day North Dakota. Fast forward a couple years, and she's actually sold. It's debated whether or not she was sold or traded. Neither is a good option. But she was sold to this French-Canadian trapper who was named Toussaint Charbonneau. Soon after, she actually became pregnant with her first child. And then 2 months after she gave birth, Lewis and Clark show up. Lewis and Clark were actually hired by the current president at the time, Thomas Jefferson, who had recently bought a land known as Louisiana Purchase, which is everything west of the Mississippi, actually up to Oregon. So Oregon and Washington weren't a part of the original deal. It was kind of like a no man's land in a sense. But, Lewis and Clark being Americans, typically how the Americans thought at the time, they just kept on moving west and just went all the way to the coast. But before they could make it there, they stopped in North Dakota, where they actually met Sacajawea and her husband. And they realized that having Sacajawea with them would be a huge benefit because she was bilingual, so she could speak the languages that were used by the Native American tribes in the area. So Lewis and Clark would have an easier time moving through. Because at that time, the Americans weren't well liked by the Native Americans, to put it plainly. The American colonists treated Native American tribes horribly. I mean, they were literally coming on to land that the Native Americans had already had claim to, and basically was just like, your claim's not valid, and I'm just taking it for myself. So obviously the Native American tribes were not too happy to see a party of American settlers move through their land. However, with Sacajawea with them, they would be less likely to be seen as a war party, so therefore hostile, and most Native American tribes were okay with letting them move through, as long as, they didn't stay. So she was with Lewis and Clark all the way from North Dakota, all the way until they reached the coast. And a little fun fact about her, during one of the river crossings, the boat that she was on with her, again, she's traveling along the trail with a 2-month-old on her back. So the boat that she was traveling on started to capsize, and she with quick thinking, she actually managed to save some really important maps and documents. So she managed to gain a lot of respect within the traveling party, and actually Clark of the Lewis and Clark duo actually called her his pilot, and both Lewis and Clark held Sacajawea in great esteem. So they made it to the Pacific Ocean in 1805, and then they were making their way back. And she was actually it's debated on what happened to Sacajawea after the expedition was over. Some people think that she returned home with her husband back to North Dakota, where she actually died only a few years later, in 1812 at the age of 24. But others think that she actually returned home to the Shoshone tribe, and she lived for another 70 years and died in 1884 at the age of 97. So it's a little bit up in the air because Native tribes didn't keep written records, really. All their history is passed down orally, and after the expedition party was done with her, they didn't really keep tabs on her. She was a pretty interesting lady. It takes a lot to be able to travel that distance with a child on your back, so that's pretty cool. That's pretty neat. Let's call this trivia time. Some quick trivia about Sacajawea. Let's see, she had 2 kids. Her first son, who traveled with her, was named Jean-Baptiste. And then it's possible that a few years after the expedition, she had a daughter named Lizette. And then, let's see, what else? Clark had some nicknames for both Sacajawea and her son. He called Sacajawea Janie, and then her son was called Pomp or Pompey. So it's actually disputed how Sacagawea's name is spelt. Some people think that it's spelled Sacagawea, and some people switch the G with the J. Also, it's debated if it's Sacajawea or Sacajawea. Oh, another fun fact, during her trip back, she actually linked back up with her previous tribe, the Shoshone tribe that she was kidnapped from years prior, and she actually learned that her brother was now tribal chief, so that also gained some good points for the expedition moving westward, so they were able to trade a lot of supplies with them. But, despite meeting her brother again after 6 or 7 years, she still stayed with Lewis and Clark and moved west, and then eventually, depending on which version you believe, she either went back and lived with her brother, with her family, or she went back to North Dakota. She did all this at the age of 16. She was 16 years old when she was walking across the trail with her kid on her back. So yeah, she's pretty cool lady.